The story of Asher and Zoe's ill-fated romance began on a crisp autumn morning at the Millbrook Farmers Market. Asher, a 28-year-old software developer with a penchant for locally sourced produce, was examining a display of heirloom tomatoes when he quite literally bumped into Zoe. The 26-year-old veterinary technician had been distracted by a text message from work, and the collision sent her phone clattering to the ground. Asher immediately apologized, bending down to retrieve the device. Their eyes met as he handed it back, and in that moment, something clicked. Zoe was struck by Asher's warm eyes and boyish grin, while Asher found himself captivated by Zoe's infectious laugh and the way her nose crinkled when she smiled. They struck up a conversation, discovering a shared love for hiking and animal rescue. Before long, they had wandered through the entire market together, sampling local cheeses and discussing their favorite trails in the nearby Sawtooth National Forest. As the market began to close down, Asher gathered the courage to ask Zoe out for coffee, and she eagerly accepted. Their relationship blossomed quickly. Weekends were filled with hikes in the mountains, volunteering at the local animal shelter, and cozy evenings cooking together in Asher's modest bungalow. They found in each other not just a romantic partner, but a best friend and confidant. To those around them, Asher and Zoe seemed like the perfect couple, young, in love, and full of promise. No one could have predicted the storm that was brewing on the horizon, threatening to destroy not only their relationship, but the very fabric of their lives. 6 months into their whirlwind romance, Asher decided it was time to take the next step. He meticulously planned a surprise proposal, knowing that Zoe would appreciate something meaningful and personal rather than a grand gesture. On a crisp Saturday morning in early spring, Asher suggested they take their favorite hike up to Sawtooth Lake. Zoe readily agreed, unaware of the small velvet box tucked away in Asher's backpack. As they reached the summit, breathless and exhilarated, Asher led Zoe to a scenic overlook. With the crystal-clear waters of the lake stretching out before them, and the jagged peaks of the Sawtooth Range as a backdrop, Asher got down on one knee. He spoke from the heart, telling Zoe how she had brought light and love into his life, how he couldn't imagine spending a day without her. Tears welled up in Zoe's eyes as Asher presented the ring, a delicate vintage piece that had belonged to his grandmother. Without hesitation, Zoe said yes. They embraced, laughing and crying, as the magnitude of the moment washed over them. As they made their way back down the trail, they excitedly discussed their future, making plans and dreaming of the life they would build together. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Millbrook. Congratulations poured in from friends, family, and even casual acquaintances. Asher's parents were overjoyed, immediately beginning to plan an engagement party to celebrate the couple. It was during the early stages of wedding planning that Asher brought up the subject of his best man. Without a second thought, he told Zoe he wanted to ask his childhood friend, Flynn Reeves, to stand beside him on their big day. Asher and Flynn had been inseparable growing up, though their paths had diverged after high school, when Flynn left Millbrook to join the military. Zoe had heard stories about Flynn, but had never met him. She was eager to get to know the person who had played such a significant role in Asher's life. When Flynn accepted the invitation to be best man, and announced he would be returning to Millbrook for an extended stay to help with the wedding preparations, Zoe was genuinely excited. Little did any of them know that Flynn's arrival would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. As the excitement of the engagement settled, Asher and Zoe dove headfirst into wedding planning. They set a date for the following summer, giving themselves a year to organize their perfect day. However, they quickly discovered that planning a wedding was far more stressful and time-consuming than they had anticipated. Zoe threw herself into the details, spending hours poring over bridal magazines and Pinterest boards. She was determined to create a celebration that reflected both her and Asher's personalities, a rustic yet elegant affair that would showcase the natural beauty of their beloved Idaho. Asher, while supportive, found himself increasingly overwhelmed by the endless decisions and mounting costs. It was during this time that Flynn arrived in Millbrook. He slipped seamlessly back into town life, charming everyone with his easygoing manner and tales of his military adventures. Flynn's presence was a welcome distraction for Asher, who was grateful to have his old friend to lean on when the wedding planning became too much. Flynn threw himself into his role as best man with gusto. He offered to help with everything from venue scouting to menu tasting. Zoe, initially appreciative of the extra help, found herself spending more and more time with Flynn as Asher's work commitments began to increase. Asher's startup was going through a critical growth phase, requiring long hours and frequent video conferences with investors. While he felt guilty about not being more involved in the wedding preparations, he was also secretly relieved that Flynn was there to pick up the slack. As the months passed, Subtle shifts began to occur in the dynamics between the three. Zoe and Flynn developed an easy rapport, bonding over their shared love of adventure and their experiences of feeling like outsiders in the close-knit Millbrook community. They would often find themselves lost in conversation, discussing everything from their favorite books to their deepest fears and aspirations. Asher, preoccupied with work and trusting in the strength of his relationship with Zoe, failed to notice the growing connection between his fiancée and his best friend. When he did spend time with them together, he was simply happy to see the two most important people in his life getting along so well. But beneath the surface, tensions were brewing. Zoe found herself increasingly drawn to Flynn's attentive nature and the way he seemed to truly listen when she spoke. Flynn, for his part, began to question why Asher deserved someone as vibrant and compassionate as Zoe. As the wedding day drew nearer, the lines between friendship and attraction began to blur, setting the stage for a betrayal that would have devastating consequences for all involved. The pivotal moment that would alter the course of their lives occurred on a rain-soaked evening in late autumn. Asher was away on a business trip, leaving Zoe alone to finalize some wedding details. Flynn, ever the attentive best man, offered to come over and help. As thunder rumbled outside, Zoe and Flynn sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by seating charts and sample invitations. The bottle of wine they had opened to take the edge off the tedious task was now almost empty. Their conversation, which had started with wedding talk, had drifted to more personal topics. Flynn, his inhibitions lowered by the wine, began to speak about his experiences in the military, not the sanitized versions he usually shared, but the raw, haunting memories that kept him up at night. Zoe listened intently, moved by his vulnerability. In that moment, she saw past the charming exterior to the complex, wounded man beneath. Almost without realizing it, they had moved closer together. When Flynn's hand brushed against hers, neither pulled away. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Then, in a moment that would haunt them both, Flynn leaned in and kissed Zoe. For a second, Zoe responded, caught up in the intensity of the moment. But reality quickly came crashing back. She pulled away abruptly, knocking over her wine glass in the process. As red liquid spread across the carefully arranged papers, Zoe and Flynn stared at each other in shocked silence. Zoe was the first to speak, her voice shaky. "We can't do this, Flynn. I love Asher. I'm marrying Asher." Flynn nodded, his face a mask of regret and confusion. "I'm sorry, Zoe. I don't know what came over me. Let's just forget this ever happened." But forgetting proved impossible. In the days that followed, Zoe was consumed by guilt. She considered telling Asher, but the thought of hurting him and potentially derailing their relationship over one misguided kiss seemed unthinkable. Flynn, for his part, kept his distance, throwing himself into best man duties with renewed vigor. Yet the seed had been planted. Zoe found her thoughts drifting to Flynn at odd moments. She caught herself comparing him to Asher, noting the differences in their personalities, their approaches to life. Flynn, despite his best efforts to respect his friend's relationship, couldn't shake the feeling that he and Zoe shared a connection that went beyond mere friendship. Weeks passed, and the tension between them grew. Stolen glances turned into lingering touches. Innocent text messages about wedding planning became late-night conversations about their hopes and fears. They both knew they were treading dangerous ground, but neither seemed able to stop. The affair itself began almost inevitably. Asher was once again out of town, this time for a week-long conference. Flynn offered to help Zoe with some DIY wedding decorations. One thing led to another, and soon they found themselves in each other's arms. All thoughts of loyalty and friendship momentarily forgotten in a haze of passion and forbidden desire. In the aftermath, both Zoe and Flynn were racked with guilt. They swore it would never happen again, that they would focus on the wedding and put their momentary lapse in judgment behind them. But the intensity of their connection proved too strong to resist. Over the next few months, they engaged in an intricate dance of secrecy and desire. Clandestine meetings in out-of-the-way spots, coded text messages, and elaborate excuses became the norm. Each time, they promised themselves it would be the last. Each time they found themselves drawn back together. As the wedding day approached, the weight of their deception began to take its toll. Zoe became distant and irritable with Asher, while Flynn struggled to look his best friend in the eye. The guilt was consuming them both, but the thrill of their forbidden romance had become like a drug neither could give up. Little did they know that their carefully constructed web of lies was about to unravel in the most devastating way possible. As the wedding day drew nearer, Asher began to notice subtle changes in Zoe's behavior. The woman who had once been so excited about every aspect of their wedding plans now seemed distracted and sometimes even irritated when discussing the upcoming nuptials. She was spending more time away from home, often citing errands or meetings with vendors that Asher couldn't recall being on their original planning list. At first, Asher chalked it up to pre-wedding jitters. He knew how much pressure Zoe was under to make everything perfect, and he tried to be understanding. But as the weeks went by, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One evening, as Asher was working late in his home office, he overheard Zoe on the phone in the next room. Her voice was hushed, but he could hear the warmth and intimacy in her tone. It wasn't the way she usually spoke to her friends or family. When he asked her about the call later, Zoe brushed it off, claiming it was just a work colleague. But Asher noticed the way she avoided eye contact as she answered. Incidents like these began to pile up. Zoe's phone would buzz with text messages that she'd quickly hide from view. She started taking her phone with her everywhere, even to the bathroom, something she had never done before. When Asher would casually ask about her day, her answers became vague and evasive. The final straw came when Asher surprised Zoe by coming home early from work one day. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw Flynn's car parked on the street. Entering the house quietly, he heard muffled voices coming from the kitchen. He walked in to find Zoe and Flynn standing unusually close together, both looking startled by his sudden appearance. That night, Asher confronted Zoe about his suspicions. "Is there something going on between you and Flynn?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Zoe's reaction was a mixture of indignation and nervousness. "How could you even think that?" she snapped. "Flynn is your best friend, and I'm marrying you. Don't be ridiculous." But her vehement denial and the way she quickly changed the subject only served to deepen Asher's doubts. He found himself analyzing every interaction between Zoe and Flynn, noting the inside jokes they seemed to share, the way their eyes would meet across a room. Asher's once unshakable trust in both his fiancée and his best friend began to crumble. He started checking Zoe's phone when she was in the shower, scrolling through her text messages and call logs. He felt ashamed of his actions, but the gnawing suspicion in his gut wouldn't let him stop. As the suspicions grew, Asher's behavior changed too. He became moody and withdrawn, snapping at Zoe over small things. The once happy couple now moved around each other like wary strangers, the air between them thick with unspoken accusations and guilt. Asher knew he needed proof, either to confirm his worst fears, or to put his suspicions to rest once and for all. With a heavy heart, he decided to dig deeper, unaware that his investigation would soon uncover a truth that would shatter his world completely. The moment of truth came on a rainy Tuesday evening, just 3 weeks before the wedding. Asher had been pretending to sleep when Zoe got up in the middle of the night, presumably to use the bathroom. But instead of hearing the bathroom door close, he heard the faint sound of typing coming from the living room. Heart pounding, Asher silently made his way down the hallway. He found Zoe curled up on the couch, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone screen. She was so engrossed in whatever she was doing that she didn't notice him approach. In that moment, all of Asher's doubts and fears crystallized into a terrible certainty. Without thinking, he snatched the phone from Zoe's hands. She let out a startled cry, reaching for the device, but Asher had already seen enough. On the screen was a series of intimate text messages between Zoe and Flynn, leaving no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The confrontation that followed was ugly and raw. Zoe's initial denials quickly crumbled in the face of the evidence. Tears streaming down her face, she admitted to the affair, begging Asher to understand that it had been a mistake, that she still loved him and wanted to marry him. Asher, his world collapsing around him, could barely process her words. The betrayal cut deep, not just from Zoe, but from Flynn, the friend he had trusted implicitly since childhood. In a daze, he left the house, ignoring Zoe's pleas for him to stay and talk things through. He found himself driving to Flynn's apartment, fueled by a rage he had never experienced before. When Flynn opened the door, bleary-eyed and confused, Asher's fist connected with his jaw before either of them could speak a word. The ensuing fight was brief but brutal, years of friendship dissolved in a flurry of punches and bitter accusations. By the time Asher stormed out, leaving Flynn nursing a bloody nose and a bruised ego, their relationship was irreparably shattered. In the days that followed, Asher shut himself away, ignoring calls and messages from both Zoe and Flynn. He wrestled with what to do next. Should he call off the wedding? Should he try to forgive Zoe and salvage their relationship? Or should he go through with the ceremony, only to expose their betrayal in front of everyone they knew? As the wedding day approached, Asher made his decision, one that would have fatal consequences for all involved. The morning of August 15th dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for a wedding in the picturesque town of Millbrook. But beneath the surface of smiles and congratulations, An undercurrent of tension ran through the preparations. Asher had ultimately decided to go through with the wedding, much to everyone's surprise and relief. He had emerged from his self-imposed isolation a week before the big day, calmly informing Zoe that he wanted to proceed as planned. Zoe, tearfully grateful for this apparent second chance, threw herself into last-minute preparations with renewed vigor. Flynn, sporting a fading bruise on his jaw, had tried to bow out as best man, but Asher had insisted he fulfill his duties. The message was clear. Everything would appear normal until Asher decided otherwise. As guests began to arrive at the rustic barn venue Zoe had chosen for the ceremony, the atmosphere was a strange mix of celebration and unease. Those closest to the couple could sense that something was off, but no one could quite put their finger on what. Zoe, resplendent in her vintage-inspired lace gown, was a bundle of nerves as she prepared in a small room at the back of the barn. Her bridesmaids fluttered around her, adjusting her veil and offering words of encouragement. But Zoe's eyes kept darting to her phone, checking for messages from Flynn. They hadn't spoken since the confrontation with Asher, and the silence was eating away at her. Meanwhile, Asher stood stoically in a small anteroom, allowing his groomsman to adjust his tie and slap him on the back. Flynn hovered at the edges of the group, his usual charm replaced by a palpable anxiety. He kept trying to catch Asher's eye, desperate for some sign of what his old friend was thinking, but Asher's face remained an unreadable mask. As the ceremony began, guests couldn't help but notice the tension between the bride and groom as they stood before the officiant. Zoe's smile seemed forced, her eyes glistening with what many assumed were tears of joy, but were in fact tears of guilt and fear. Asher's jaw was clenched, his responses to the officiant's questions clipped and devoid of emotion. When it came time for the vows, a hush fell over the assembled guests. Zoe went first, her voice trembling as she promised love and fidelity to Asher. As she spoke, her eyes inadvertently flicked to Flynn, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the groom. Then it was Asher's turn. He cleared his throat, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might actually go through with the charade. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, his parents beaming with pride, Zoe's friends dabbing at their eyes, Flynn shifting uncomfortably in his spot, something inside him snapped. Instead of reciting the vows he had prepared, Asher began to speak in a calm, clear voice that carried to every corner of the barn. He told the assembled guests about the betrayal he had uncovered, about the affair between his bride-to-be and his best man. As shocked gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, Asher's words became more heated, his carefully maintained composure crumbling as weeks of pain and anger poured out. Zoe stood frozen, her face a mask of horror and shame. Flynn, his fight-or-flight instinct kicking in, began to edge towards the exit. But Asher wasn't finished. He turned to Flynn, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he thanked him for being such a devoted friend and best man. It was at that moment, with tensions at a breaking point and the entire assembly in shock, that Flynn made a decision that would turn this day of supposed celebration into a tragedy that would haunt Millbrook for years to come. In the charged atmosphere of the barn, with all eyes fixed on the unfolding drama at the altar, no one noticed Flynn's hand slip inside his jacket. It wasn't until the metallic glint of the pistol caught the light that the true gravity of the situation became apparent. Time seemed to slow down. Guests who moments ago had been frozen in shock now began to react, some diving for cover, others too stunned to move. Zoe's scream pierced the air as she realized what was about to happen. Asher, caught up in the catharsis of his revelation, didn't immediately register the danger. He was in the middle of a bitter tirade against Flynn when the first shot rang out, the sound deafening in the enclosed space of the barn. The bullet caught Asher in the chest, the impact spinning him around. As he fell, a second shot was fired, and then a third. Chaos erupted as panicked guests rushed for the exits, their screams and shouts creating a cacophony of terror. Zoe, her white dress now spattered with blood, fell to her knees beside Asher's crumpled form. Her trembling hands pressed against his wounds, desperately trying to stem the flow of blood. Flynn stood rooted to the spot, the gun hanging limply at his side as the magnitude of what he had done washed over him. In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching. Someone had had the presence of mind to call 911. But for Asher, it was already too late. As Zoe cradled his head in her lap, sobbing and begging him to hold on, the light in his eyes began to fade. By the time the first responders arrived on the scene, Asher Holloway was gone, his life cut short on what should have been the happiest day of his life. The idyllic town of Millbrook was plunged into shock and grief in the wake of the tragic events at the Holloway-Brennan wedding. Yellow police tape cordoned off the barn, transforming what was meant to be a place of celebration into a grim crime scene. Emergency responders had arrived within minutes of the shooting, But despite their best efforts, Asher was pronounced dead at the scene. Flynn, still holding the weapon, had offered no resistance when the police arrived, allowing himself to be handcuffed and led away in a daze. Zoe, her wedding dress stained with blood, was taken to the local hospital in a state of shock. As news of the shooting spread, the hospital waiting room filled with stunned family members and friends, all struggling to comprehend the tragedy that had unfolded. The investigation moved quickly. Detective Lydia Hawthorne, a seasoned investigator from the Idaho State Police, was called in to lead the case. She and her team worked tirelessly, interviewing witnesses, collecting evidence, and piecing together the events that had led to this fatal conclusion. The gun was quickly traced back to Flynn. It was a legally owned firearm, registered in his name, a souvenir from his military days. This fact would later become a point of contention in the trial, with the prosecution arguing it showed premeditation, while the defense claimed it was merely coincidence that Flynn had been carrying it. As the investigation deepened, the full extent of the affair between Zoe and Flynn came to light. Text messages, emails, and witness statements painted a picture of a relationship that had spiraled out of control, culminating in the disastrous events of the wedding day. Asher's parents, devastated by the loss of their only son, retreated from public view. Their pain was compounded by the betrayal of Zoe, whom they had come to love as a daughter. In a brief statement released through their lawyer, they asked for privacy and expressed their disbelief at the tragic turn of events. Zoe, upon her release from the hospital, went into hiding, hounded by press and vilified by many in the community who blamed her for the tragedy. Her absence from Asher's funeral was noted and criticized, though those closest to the situation understood that her presence would have only caused more pain for Asher's grieving family. Flynn, held without bail, awaited trial in the county jail. His military background and the nature of the crime made him a high-profile inmate, kept in isolation for his own protection. As weeks turned into months, the people of Millbrook struggled to come to terms with the tragedy that had occurred in their midst. The barn, once a popular wedding venue, stood empty, a silent reminder of the day when a celebration of love had turned into a nightmare of betrayal and death. In the end, the jury found Flynn guilty of second-degree murder. The judge, taking into account Flynn's military service but also the brutal nature of the crime, sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison.